Today we shall discuss the poem Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson, which is for the final year students. This poem is written by Emily Dickinson. She was a poetess who was in love with death. That means she wanted to experience all the aspects of death. And that is what has been described in this poem. In the very title of the poem, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, shows that how much she was in love with death. And in the first paragraph, she says, Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. As the poetess could not wait for the death, she says that the death personified as a lover, he stopped for her and he spared time for her. Death himself came to her. He came in a carriage and invited the poetess to go with him for a ride. In the second paragraph, she says, We slowly drove. He knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. In as death personified as a lover came to the poetess and took her for a ride in his carriage, the he he was driving his carriage very slowly. He was in no haste, no hurry. And the poetess also put away all her worldly activities to accompany death. She gave up all the labor and leisure of her life. She did so in order to reciprocate the courtesy of death. The poetess means to say that all the activities of man come to an end with the death. Because she accepts the fact of death calmly, there is no pain in her thought of death. Normally, people are afraid of death at the very thought of death, but poetess is not. And very calmly, she is accompanying death. Then in the third paragraph, she says, We pass the school where children strew at recess in a ring. We pass the fields of gazing grain. We pass the setting sun. In these lines, the poetess personifies all the three stages of man's life. Like number in the first lines, she says that she describes the children playing in the field, in the school playground. The childhood is the first stage of man's life. And while accompanying death, she is thinking about the first stage of her life where she is describing that children were playing wrestling in a ring. Then she recalls the second stage of life and symbolizes it by the grain fields. Grain symbolizes the ripeness. Middle age is the ripe age. And she describes the crops in the fields. Symbolically, she says the middle age of the person, she is remembering the middle age of the her own life. And in fact, she in the third and lastly she describes that the old age, which is the symbol of setting sun as described in the lines. So all the three stages, childhood, youth and old age, has been described, which she is recalling while accompanying death. As when the death comes, man thinks of all the three stages of death. In the fourth paragraph, she says, We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice but a mound. Here she says that one day death took her when Death took her for a ride in the carriage. They reached a house. This was a house whose roof was barely visible. Actually, it was the grave where a person is taken after the death. And most of it was buried under the ground as the grave is. And she describes that grave, which is the final stage where a person reaches after the death. Here, the journey of man's life ends. When her carriage stopped before the grave, they paused for few seconds. And this is what has been described. And in the last line, she says, since then it is centuries and yet each feels shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. Here the poetess describes her vision of life after death. It were centuries. Actually, she says centuries have passed since her journey with death, and yet each of these centuries now seem to be shorter than a day, even. Because she feels so comfortable in the company of death that centuries also spent like a day in the company of death for her. And then she says there is no concept of time when we are in the company of our lover, that is death here in this case. It is a timeless and deathless word. The poetess says that even at the time of the ride with death, she had guessed that the horses of the carriage were leading her to eternity. These lines show that the poetess believes in eternity after physical death. This poem is a symbolic poem of love with the death which the poetess had, and in she has described all the three stages of man's life also before reaching the grave. So this poem is about the final journey of man's life. Thank you.